Okay, Sully's on the couch and Scout just jumped off the table and you're ready and I'm ready. So today we're going to talk about one of my favorite authors when I was a kid, and I still like her books. I'm going to talk to you about Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote about being a pioneer back in the old days. So I have something to show you. So let me share my screen with my mad tech skills. You'd think I'd get better at this, but I never do. Oh well. And we're going to go from current slide. There we go. All right. So on February the 1st of 1860, so just before the Civil War began, Charles Philip Ingalls and Carolyn Lake, I think that's Quiner, but it may be Quiner, I'm not sure, were married in Concord, Wisconsin. Now, these are Laura Ingalls' parents. She called them Ma and Pa through all of the books that she wrote, and she wrote a number of books. In 1862, Congress had passed the Homestead Act. This granted 160 acres of land that could be claimed free. You didn't have to pay. I think there was like a processing fee or something, but it was a lot less than you would have to pay for the whole 160 acres out in the West in the unsettled lands. Now remember, there were already people living there, but they were not people that were citizens of the United States. Okay, it was the Native Americans that were already living out there. The settlers had to improve the land by building a house, they call it a residence, and planting and raising crops. And I think they had to do this for it was either 5 or 10 years, I've forgotten, because there's two different ones, and I think this one may have been 10 years. And after that, they owned the land. They could sell it, they could do whatever they wanted to with it. Now look at this map of the United States at the time. Everything that's in red, that's up for being claimed. That means it was not a state at that time. Those were territories, and they could be settled and claimed. Okay, if you found land that nobody was living on already, no citizen was living on already, you could claim it. This was a big, big deal. Because think about Europe, think about England. England had been settled for thousands of years at this point, almost 2,000 years for sure that we know of in recorded history. And it's a very small island. All of the land is gone, and mostly it's owned by people that have got way more money than you did, you know? And so if you were a poor person in Europe, the only way you were going to have a chance at getting land was to come to America and claim some of this land. And so this is what begins a lot of the influx, the coming in of people from Europe to try to get some of this land out west in the unsettled lands. Okay, so in the state of Wisconsin, the Ingalls family moved to the big woods of Wisconsin. Charles and Carolyn and Henry and Polly Quiner, that was Carolyn's uncle, bought 80 acres for $335. They split it between them, and they split the 80 acres. So today, this is a reproduction. That means it was built special of the home that the Ingalls family built, that lived in. And it stands on some of the property that the family originally owned, and it's near the town of Stockholm, Washington. This is where the first book takes place, Little House in the Big Woods. And so there's a description of the cabin, and someone has gone back and built this cabin. It's now a tourist attraction. You can go and visit it. So while they were living in the Big Woods, Mary Amelia Ingalls was born on January the 10th of 1865, right around the same time, in the same year anyway, that the Civil War ended and Lincoln was assassinated, just to kind of set you in time where we are right now. This is Mary. Now, obviously, this is a picture of her when she was an adult, not when she was a baby. Laura Elizabeth Ingalls was born on February 7th of 1867, so they're about 2 years apart. And this is Laura. In 1868, the Ingalls family moved to Chariton County, Missouri. Not a whole lot's known about what they did during that time. Laura didn't write much about it. But the Osage Indians over in what is kind of now Kansas had signed a treaty giving the US government control of their land. But we do know that Pa didn't like to live places where there were beginning to be a lot of people. And basically, almost as soon as there was a town, he wanted to move and go somewhere further west and stay in the pioneer countries. So in 1869, the Ingalls family leaves Missouri and settles in Kansas. Their daughter, Caroline Celestia, it's a good name, who was always called Carrie Ingalls, was born August the 3rd of 1870. Now, this is the time period where Laura writes the book Little House on the Prairie, or writes the book about. She wasn't writing it when they were living there. But what had happened was there was word that the Osage Indians who had given up their land were going to be moved, and they didn't know this yet. But the American government already knew they were going to move them somewhere else and open that land up for people to go and settle. The Ingalls family got there before all of that was done. And so they were kind of a little too early. Maybe that was on purpose. Maybe there was just a misunderstanding. We don't exactly know what the thinking process was there. Did Pa really think it was okay to go do this? Did Pa think, hey, this is about to happen. I'll get out there and I'll get some good land and I'll be one of the first ones. Yay, me. And a lot of people felt that way, you know. Anyway, the Ingalls family was moved off the land in Kansas by soldiers. But before they did that, they saw the Osage Indians going by in the procession that was sort of like basically the Osage Trail of Tears, leaving their land and going to the reservation. But the soldiers came in and cleared the land of everybody else that was on it and said, you know, you can't be here yet. You have to go out, and if you're going to homestead, you have to come back in and reclaim. So the Ingalls family moved back to Pepin, Wisconsin, which is where they had lived before. There's some dispute about, you know, did they move back there because they didn't have any other place to go? Or there's some question or some notation that maybe the people that had bought their land in Wisconsin couldn't pay for it. And so they moved back there to take that land back over and attempt to resell it. Anyway, during this time period, Laura attended school for the first time. She was just about the right age to start going to school. And this also was the year 1871 that The Wonders of the Animal World by G. Hartwig was published. If you read the books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, she talks about the Big Green Book, Pa's Big Green Animal Book. That's what this book was. And so they had pictures of different kinds of animals that, you know, people that didn't travel the world wouldn't see, because, you know, there's lots of different kinds of animals in lots of different places. And if you didn't go there at that time, you wouldn't see them because there weren't zoos yet. So you couldn't go and see these animals. In 1873, Congress passed the Timber Culture Act. This was proposed by a senator from Nebraska, and it was a follow-up to the 1862 Homestead Act. It granted an additional 160 acres of free land if the settler would agree to plant 40 acres of that land in trees, because this is the Great Plains. This is the largest grassland in the United States. It's where the buffalo lived, because it was mostly just acres and acres and acres and miles and miles and miles of grass. There weren't a whole lot of trees. And, you know, if you're going to settle stuff, people are going to live out there. They're going to want some trees to be able to have lumber to build houses, etc. So they wanted this land, some of it planted in trees, and this was a way to get it done. You had to plant 40 acres in trees, and after 5 years, if you could, you know, if you proved up and showed that you had done this, then you would get title to the land and it would be yours. This is one of the advertising flyers that went out and people could see, and they went to the places in the United States and they went all over the world to show people, look, come and get some of this free land. So in 1874, the Ingalls family moved from Wisconsin to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Now, if you have watched the TV show Little House on the Prairie, this is where Walnut Grove is where that TV show takes place. It didn't really take place when they lived on the prairie where the book Little House on the Prairie was written. It was written during the time where they lived here on Walnut Creek. And during that time period is covered kind of in the book called On the Banks of Plum Creek. In 1875, Charles Frederick, or Freddie Ingalls, was born on November the 1st. But sadly, in 1876, on August the 27th, Freddie died. Now, Laura doesn't talk about Freddie at all in her books that she wrote, and I think it was just too upsetting for her to write about it. Now, this is a reproduction, yeah, that's the word I want, of the house that they lived in Walnut Grove. And that means it was built special. It's not the same house. It didn't survive. There is a place, the original house that they lived in was called a dugout, which is an underground house dug into the banks of the creek. And then it's just, it's like a cave, but it was made on purpose. That there is still, they do know where that was, and there's still a place where it's washed out. It didn't survive, but they can see where it was. And so if you go to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, you can actually go and see that place. But this is a museum now, and it mostly focuses on the television show, which is wildly different from the books, but still a lot of people like it. It was a good show. I watched it when I was a kid. There you are. The family moved in 1876 to Burr Oak, Iowa, to help run the Masters Hotel. This was the Masters Hotel. It is still there. And in 1877, Grace Pearl Ingalls was born on May the 23rd. So that's the last of the children that we know of that was born, and I think that's probably the last of them because something would have been mentioned. The family returned to Walnut Grove, Minnesota in 1877, and in 1879, Mary became ill with what we believe was scarlet fever, and she began to lose her sight. She began to go blind. That used to happen a lot with people who caught scarlet fever because their fever would go up very, very high, and they didn't have the medication they needed to be able to bring their fevers down and get rid of this fever. And a lot of the damage that was done with scarlet fever was it created blindness in a lot of people. The family moved in 1879 to the Dakota Territory, I don't know what I'm talking about, and moved to what was going to become the town of De Smet. In 1879, as a side note, Almanzo, his brother Royal, and their sister Eliza Jane Wilder filed for homestead claims near the town of De Smet. That's going to become important later on. In 1880, the Ingalls family moves to their homestead. They had a homestead out in the territory, but they also had a house or a building in town. And I think Pa had figured that he would build this building and then at some point be able to sell it and make some money. But they had to return to town and live in their building in town because this was the book, The Long Winter. Before that, when they first moved out to De Smet in the Dakota Territory, I can't say that word this morning, the Dakota Territory, that's when the events in the book By the Shores of Silver Lake take place. And then the next book is The Long Winter. And that takes place during this time period, 1880. This was a terrible winter. It's extremely cold winter. And remember, there's not a lot of trees to be used for firewood and things. So in the book, Laura talks about how she and her father would go out and cut grass that was dried, like hay that was dried. And then they would twist it and twist it and twist it into long braids. And that's what they would burn to heat the house because they didn't have anything else. They almost starved to death. I'm not going to tell you what happens because you may want to read the book. Obviously, they didn't starve to death, but Almanzo and Royal Wilder were involved in the reason they didn't starve to death. I'm not going to tell you why. If you want to know, you have to read the book. And at some point during this time period, Pa is actually elected a justice of the peace in De Smet. In 1881, Mary, Carrie, and Laura have their photographs taken for the first time. So this would be Laura, this will be Mary, and this is Carrie. Grace is not in the photograph. And this was the first time they'd had their picture taken, because taking pictures back then was not like it is now. You know, everybody had a camera on their phone, and you just take pictures wherever you go. You had to go to a special photography studio. You had to stand very still, and it was fairly expensive. So this was a big deal that they had their photograph taken, and this was the first time they'd have their photograph taken. And also in 1881, Mary leaves the family and goes to the Iowa School for the Blind. And this is starting to be the time period in here where the book Little Town on the Prairie takes place. In 1882, Laura receives her teacher's certificate, and she actually goes to a town, I think it was something like 12 or 16 miles away, to teach. And they didn't have cars, so she had to board with the family that owned this school, or the town that had the school. And the book, These Happy Golden Years, starts off talking about her becoming a teacher and some of the things that happened. And she was about 16. So if you read that book, remember, Laura's 16 when all of this is going on. In 1884, she and Almanzo Wilder get engaged. So Laura and Almanzo were married on August the 25th of 1885 in De Smet Township. In 1886, Rose Wilder was born on December the 5th. This is a picture of Laura and Almanzo. I don't know if this is actually their wedding picture, but this is a picture of them. And then this is Rose, obviously not when she was a baby. But in 1888, Laura and Almanzo caught a disease called diphtheria. And diphtheria attacks, it forms mucus in your throat, and you can't breathe. And it's a very severe disease. When you're a baby now, you get a vaccination so that you won't get it, because it was extremely deadly, and lots of people died, and lots of people got sick to the point where they were handicapped from then on. It could change your whole life. In 1889, Laura and Almanzo's son is born, but he died 12 days later. They didn't name this child, and I think it was because they were still getting over being sick. Laura didn't get too bad. She got over being sick, and she was still healthy the rest of her life. But Almanzo, he didn't get over it very well. He had lost a lot of the strength in his legs. He had to walk on crutches the rest of his life, and he's still a young man. And he couldn't work as hard or as long as he had been able to before, which was hard on the family. And it's bound to have been hard on him. He was a hardworking man. He didn't really want anybody's help. And here he is, and now he's not able to take care of things. Also in that same time period, their first home was destroyed by fire, and Mary graduated from the School for the Blind. So the family, the Wilder family, when I talk about the family now, I'm talking about Laura and Almanzo and Rose. In 1890, they moved to Spring Valley, Minnesota, to live for a year with Almanzo's parents. Now, this is the house. I'll get to that in just a second. The Wilders then moved in 1891 to Westerville, Florida, and I think they were looking for a place for Almanzo that would be a different climate and maybe help Almanzo's health. It didn't, and so eventually they do return. In 1892, the Wilders moved back to De Smet, South Dakota. Pa had sold his claim by then and added a 2-story wing onto the room in town. And in De Smet, South Dakota, you can see this house. And this is the actual house that Pa built in the town of De Smet. and it may have been added on to some during the time period. I'm not really sure, but this is the house. It is not a museum. It's a privately owned house. People live in it, but you can drive by and see it. This is the house that Pa built. Everybody in town knows this house. So in 1894, the Wilders traveled to Mansfield, Missouri, and purchased the Rocky Ridge Farm. In 1902, Pa, Charles Ingalls, died on June the 8th. He died of congestive heart failure. And Laura had gone back to visit him. And Laura ended up with the fiddle he gave her. He always played the fiddle, and Laura ended up with that. In 1909, Rose Wilder married a man named Gillette Lane and moved to San Francisco. Now, while she was in San Francisco, she became a newspaper reporter, and she was writing books and short stories and things and doing very well. She was a very accomplished author. And in 1924, she actually bought and gave Laura and Almanzo a new car and taught Almanzo how to drive it. Carolyn Ingalls, Ma, died April the 20th in 1924. And in 1928, on October the 17th, Mary, Laura's oldest sister, suffered a stroke and died. So in 1930, Laura's 63 years old. She hasn't started writing her books yet. This is the farm at Rocky Ridge, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So Rose had been talking to Laura about the fact that apparently she told really good stories about when she was a little girl, and Rose had been talking to her about the fact that maybe she ought to write some of these stories down. And so Laura did start at some point writing these stories down. And in 1932, her first book, Little House in the Big Woods, was published. In 1933, her second book, called Farmer Boy, which is about Almanzo as a young boy growing up, was published. In 1935, Little House on the Prairie was published. And Laura and Almanzo also celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. I wrote that twice, I'm not sure why. Oh well. In 1935, and this is a picture of Laura and Rose. In 1937, On the Banks of Plum Creek was published. 1939, By the Shores of Silver Lake was published. 1940, The Long Winter was published. 1941, Little Town on the Prairie was published. And also, sadly, in 1941, on November the 10th, Grace, one of her youngest sister, Laura's youngest sister, died. Give me a second here. Sorry about that. In 1943, These Happy Golden Years was published. Her middle sister, that was the one just younger than Laura, died on June the 2nd of 1946. Almanzo died October the 23rd in 1949. He was 82 years old. In 1953, the Little House books were reissued with these covers and illustrated by a man named Garth Williams. And these are the books that we still see today. And as far as I can tell, since 1953, these books have never been out of print. You could always get them in a bookstore. Laura died on February the 10th, 1957. She was 90 years old. And I can remember when this happened in 1971, because I was alive then. The book, The First 4 Years, was found that she had written, Laura had written, but she'd never submitted it for publication. And it talks about the first 4 years that she and Almanzo were married, and when the baby boy was born, and when the house burned down and they caught diphtheria and all of that time period. It talks about all of that. So that's all I've got for that. These books are very interesting. They'd be interesting, even though they're written by a girl about a girl growing up, they're pretty interesting to boys as well. So I would encourage you to read these books. I know that they'll be in your school library. It's just, they're kind of cool. Read about them and see what happened. That's all I have for you today. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them for me. Please be nice in the comments. If you like what we talked about, please like and share and subscribe. Let me know if you have anything you would like me to talk about on another day. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for joining me. Until next time. All right, Sully, I think we're done.